welcome back to the NATO Through Time podcast, where we are exploring NATO's very rich 75-year history. Today, our focus is going to be on 1999 and the first post-Cold War enlargement of NATO. But before we get to that, let me welcome my co-host today, who is Maciej Musial, who has been with us in the podcast before. He is speaking to us from Poland. So, Maciej, I'm really pleased to have you as my co-host today, particularly as you represent the third country that we need to discuss in today's episode, which, of course, is the fact that Poland was a member of the Group of Three, joining NATO in 1999. So, Maciej, please say hello to everybody.
Hi, Jamie. It's great to be back. I wasn't involved in the accession, but I'll do my best to represent my country and ask our distinguished guests some nice questions.
Counting on you as always, Maciej, and again, welcome back. Well, as I mentioned, dear viewers and listeners, today we want to look at this first post-Cold War enlargement of the alliance. It was significant because it was the first time that NATO had embraced and had welcomed into its fold countries that had to live under communism for 40 years after 1945. This was really NATO's first big step over the Cold War divide into Central and Eastern Europe, whereby NATO took on a responsibility progressively for security and stability across the European continent, became no longer a sort of a Western European regional organisation, but an organisation serving peace in the whole of Europe. This enlargement, three countries at the time, also led the way to many further rounds of NATO enlargement, particularly the so-called Big Bang enlargement, bringing in 7 countries from Central and Eastern Europe in 2004. And in the podcast, NATO Through Time, we'll come back in a mini-series on these NATO enlargements, so those further waves. But today we want to discuss very much the significance of the Czech Republic, Poland and Hungary joining the alliance in March 1999. Now, to do this, we have 2 very special guests. Absolutely delighted to welcome them. And I'm all the more delighted because they were not only keen observers of what went on, but they had important positions in government, which meant that they were shapers of this process, actors in history as well. From Hungary, and presumably, sir, you're speaking to us from Budapest, I'm delighted to welcome János Martonyi, who was the foreign minister of Hungary at the time. He served as foreign minister from 1998 to 2002. And Minister Martonyi, you came back as foreign minister again from 2010 to 2014. So you can give us a perspective, if you like, from 1999, but also a perspective from more recently.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to join you today.
And here, joining me in the studio, I'm also delighted to welcome Ambassador Karel Kovanda, who is a former deputy foreign minister of the Czech Republic from 1997 to 1998. After that, he moved to NATO, as I know very well, because I saw him in action every week as the ambassador of the Czech Republic to NATO. He served for a good period, 1998 to 2005.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you to both of you. So let's cut to the chase. And now I'm going to go to Maciej in Warsaw to answer the first question to Minister Martonyi, please.
Let's start with some questions about your backgrounds growing up in Warsaw Pact countries. So, Minister Martonyi, you were born right at the end of the Second World War and grew up in Hungary under communist rule. Do you have any memories of Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the subsequent invasion by the Soviet Union?
Thank you, Maciej. I think this is really the right question to start our discussion, because for many of us, not only in Hungary, but also in that region, this story, at least according to many of us, did start with the revolution and what we call the freedoms fight of Hungary in 1956. Personally, I always said, and I'm still repeating, that this was the most important event for myself in shaping my political views and convictions. Concretely, of course, there was also a more difficult part of the 56 story, because in April 57, my father was arrested, taken into the custody of the police, as it was said at that time, because he was a university professor. Even if he was not directly involved in the events, of course, there was a vast intimidation operation in April 57, and in that framework, he spent a couple of days in the police's custody, and that, of course, we all remember very much in the family, especially in the light of the fact that we didn't know when he would return. So that is also, part of the story. Many people were affected in that way as well. Without their sacrifice, I think that the overall Hungarian and Central European history would have been different.
Thanks, Mr. Minister.
Ambassador Kovanda, during the Prague Spring in 1968, you were 24 years old, almost a little bit younger than I am right now. What motivated you to lead the student strikes in 1968, and how those events shaped your perspective on Czechia as a young person?
Well, Maciej, my involvement in the Czech student movement predates 1968. My friends and I started with assorted opposition types activities back in the mid 60s. So when 1968 came, it was, as it were, a culmination and a result of all our efforts as student leaders at the time. There was a major student strike in November 1968, and that was 3 months after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that's where indeed the role of students did become pivotal again. The question of motivation doesn't even occur, because anybody who would have gotten involved somehow. When we decided in Prague and subsequently and all over the what today is the Czech Republic, to go on strike, it was a sign, an expression of our belief that not everything is lost, that continued opposition does have its sense. And even though we didn't actually achieve terribly much, but what we did achieve was to demonstrate to the population that at least on the student niveau, we are not going to be satisfied and not going to succumb to the occupation by the Soviets and to the rule of their local lackeys, their quislings.
But Karel, you went off to the United States in 1970. Was this a sense of escaping from communism, escaping from the system, or purely because you wanted to study abroad?
Well, it wasn't either, actually, Jamie. The reason why I went to the United States is because my girlfriend was there. So
that's probably a more valid reason.
Yes. These are absolutely critical reasons for a person who's 25.
Minister, going back to your time living under communism in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Hungary, it is, what was the image that you had of NATO at the time? Growing up, becoming an adult, beginning your career in Hungary under communism. Did you learn about NATO at school? What kind of image did you have? What did you learn about NATO? And did you believe what you were hearing about NATO, or did you not believe it?
we should never forget that everything was in those decades, those years, of a dual nature. There was an official policy, and then there was an unofficial private mood. For the first, of course, NATO was a hostile organization. For the second, which was, I believe, the big majority of the nation, for the second was the West, a kind of symbol for Western power. To exaggerate it a little bit, a large number of people were waiting for the arrival of NATO or American troops. Of course, this is a kind of exaggeration, but still, I think for the majority, it was the West, and the West was preferred in all those decades to the East.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much. Karel, I need to ask you the same question. Did you have courses on NATO in high school in Czechoslovakia in those days?
You know, I don't remember NATO being ever discussed. Certainly not in school, and I probably didn't read that part of the newspaper which may have discussed NATO. But by and large, NATO was always perceived as an aggressive and expansionist, perhaps, and as Minister Martonyi pointed out, a hostile organization. But I don't recall that it would have been the prime focus of any foreign political discussions.
Minister Martonyi, we want to jump now to 1989, 1990, of course, that wonderful period when we had the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, and then, of course, the so-called Velvet Revolutions. At least that was the name given to the one in Czechoslovakia, but I think it applies to Hungary and many other countries as you threw off the yoke of communism and you looked to rejoin the European family. Can you tell us something about Hungary's pivotal role in the collapse of communism? Because from my experience at the time and my history books, it seems that Hungary really sort of started the whole process, right? By opening its border with Austria in 1989, the East German population then started to flee to West Germany through Czechoslovakia, through Hungary. It was an exhilarating time. You lived it, sir. So give us a sense of, if you knew what was happening, your own country's role, and what perspective you had at the time of the importance of the events taking place.
The official opening of the border was no doubt an extremely important development. According to some people, especially in Germany, that was one of the basic cause of speeding up the overall process, which ultimately resulted in what we know what it was. By the way, the official opening of the border was preceded by an initiative, let's say a so-called quote-unquote private initiative by the Pan-European Picnic, which resulted in the passing of the border a couple of hundreds of people. And the official opening of the border followed this, let's say, almost spontaneous, although to some extent pre-organized development.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Karel, a similar sort of question to you. I mean, how did you experience 1989, 1990?
Well, Jamie, Czechoslovakia's rapid movement toward democracy started in November 1989 with a demonstration again of students, a new generation of students. And the student demonstration, which was beaten up by police, continued into a general strike, actually, and with Václav Havel being emerging as an pretty much undisputed leader of this revolution. It moved very, very fast, and there were many different opinions. starting with people who felt that the ideas of Prague Spring, of, quote, democratic socialism, of, quote, socialism with a human face, that these ideas might still be relevant, and ending with people who were interested in going full bore into a fully capitalist system of economy. I think it was certainly Václav Havel who very perspicaciously saw the future necessarily linked with NATO, who ended up directing the country in that direction.
I remember, Karel, the late and great President Havel, of course, coming to NATO to speak at the North Atlantic Council. I still believe it's one of the most impressive speeches ever given by any leader in front of the NATO ambassadors, where he apologised on behalf of his country and the communist countries for all of the lies that had been told. Not that he had contributed to that, of course, but about NATO and the bad image that NATO had in Central and Eastern Europe. It was quite remarkably frank.
Thank you very much. Pass the floor now to President Havel.
Vážený pane generální tajemníku,
Distinguished Secretary General, distinguished ministers, ladies and gentlemen. From the time when I was young, I used to hear in my country from all the official authorities as well as from all media one thing only about the North Atlantic Alliance, that it was a bulwark of imperialism, a devil incarnate that posed a threat to peace and wanted to destroy us. I am happy to have this opportunity to tell from this rostrum today the truth. The North Atlantic Alliance has been and remains, pursuant to the will of democratically elected governments of its member countries, a thoroughly democratic defensive community which has made a substantial contribution to the fact that this continent has not experienced any war suffering for nearly half a century, and that a great part thereof has been saved from totalitarianism. If Western Europe can now enjoy such a measure of democracy and economic prosperity that it actually enjoys, it is undoubtedly due, among other things, to its having established, together with the United States of America and Canada, this security alliance as a tool of protection of its freedom and of the values of Western civilization. I am happy to be in a position to apologize to you today on behalf of the Czech and the Slovak peoples for all the lies which, on behalf of the same peoples, my predecessors were for years telling about you. I am happy to be allowed to address you today as a representative of a democratic and independent country which shares your ideals and wishes to cooperate with you on a basis of friendship.
So, Ambassador Kovanda, 1990, obviously things are changing in your country, things are changing in Europe. You decide to go home more or less immediately. Why was that?
Well, when I left Czechoslovakia in 1970, I left with an idea of staying away for a few weeks or months. It ended up it ended up in 20 years, and the reason. The rationale there was that whatever I learn, whatever I pick up during my stay in the United States, I will put to good use eventually when I manage to get back to my country. There was not, I didn't have the feeling of if. The question was when. And in 1989, as I was observing and listening to broadcasts from Prague in Santa Cruz, California, as to what was happening, and shedding tears that I was in Santa Cruz rather than in Prague, it became very obvious that in order to capitalize on everything that I've learned in the West and in the US, I have to go back and take part in what was going on there.
Okay, so let's now focus on the road to NATO, because that path had to be taken. And I'm interested in your personal experiences. Maybe let's start with Minister Kovanda. What was your experience of that road and all those negotiations with NATO for Czech to become a member? What it actually looked like?
In the early 90s, I was very, very busy as the Czech Ambassador to the United Nations, and I was on the UN Security Council. But in 1997, I was pulled back by my minister to act as his deputy with the specific objective of continuing the discussions with NATO that would lead to our membership. And this is exactly what happened. At the time, we were, I wouldn't say negotiating with NATO, it was more like listening to NATO, because NATO knew exactly what they wanted from us, and there was no budging from that. So we would just listen to what NATO needed from us. We would try to meet those requirements as best possible. And in these accession talks, we cooperated very closely with our friends and allies from Hungary and from Poland, Simonyi András and Andrzej Tofpik, and exchanged views about how did this round of talks go and what kinds of questions did they ask during this round and so forth. We in the Czech Republic had very, very great difficulties with some problems here. One big difficulty was the question of popular support.
Yeah.
We were in a very different situation than Poland, for example. Yeah. For Poland, the question of its security was absolutely clear. For us, the question of security wasn't nearly as hot, shall we say.
Yeah, and you felt that maybe alliances had not sort of worked so well for you in the 20th century, right?
You are right there, Jamie. But I think that this was more a veil over the people not really being interested in NATO. So this was sort of a cover story for that. But there was an important, what you might call, feel safe belief, perception, orientation in the Czech Republic, which says, why should we bother becoming members of yet another organization?
Thanks, Karel. Maciej, back to you, because we obviously need to get the minister's perspective on all this as well, from a Hungarian viewpoint.
Minister Martonyi, Hungary held a public referendum on NATO membership in 1997, in which over 85% of voters said yes to NATO. Were you surprised by the high level of support from voters?
85% supported NATO membership, although, of course, the turnout was not extremely high. It was a little bit less than 50%, but I mean, the answer of the public was quite clear. But of course, neutrality was still lingering on the mind of Hungarians for a long time as one of the basic demands of the revolution of '56. Now comes, of course, the transformation in the 80s and the late 80s, and immediately I would say the political class said, no, we don't want to be neutral anymore. The situation in the meantime changed completely. We wanted to join NATO. We want to have a place in what is called the Western democratic community of nations. There was no doubt a strong security element. Think of the Yugoslav war, south of Hungary, but also, and that's what we all underlined in those times, there was a strong value element. We wanted to belong to where the Hungarians always felt that they have to belong to. That was a return back home, a return to our natural habitat.
Minister, you mentioned the war going on in the former Yugoslavia, and in 1999, just a couple of days, in fact, after you became a NATO member, NATO launched its air campaign in Kosovo. Did this come as a bit of a shock to you in Hungary that you joined NATO to sort of for collective defence, for security, and yet one of the first things that NATO did once you joined was this intervention very close to you, obviously for good humanitarian reasons. But how did the Hungarian government, the population, perceive this intervention in Kosovo at the time?
The strikes started a couple of days after we became officially members of NATO. And the question was always raised, was it a good or a bad coincidence? My answer at that time, I was foreign minister, that in fact we were lucky to be inside NATO instead of being outside of that. And of course, there was a debate in the public opinion as well, but the government, I think, was quite adamant in representing the view that this is essentially a humanitarian action. People had to be saved. And of course, there were arguments, there were things happened before in some other parts of that region. And the main purpose of the NATO intervention was to prevent that those events, those tragic consequences can be avoided in that region.
Thanks, Minister. Briefly, Karel, from the perspective of Prague.
Yes, it certainly was our first real experience, and Prague did not take it very kindly. It's worth mentioning that the three ambassadors whom I mentioned, that we were sitting on NAC meetings for the previous number of months, and we reported from those meetings. So Prague ought to have known from our reports that the NATO's patience with President Milosevic of Yugoslavia was wearing very thin. Nevertheless, when the attacks were launched, Prague was very, shall we say, upset. And this had to do with the public perception of Yugoslavia as being a totally friendly country to Czechoslovakia through thick and thin, starting in 1947, shall we say. So there was very little understanding for our attacks on the NATO attacks in Serbia. And when I personally criticized that, I almost lost my job over that.
I remember that, indeed, from our conversations at the time. But fortunately, you didn't. Fortunately, for not just for you, but for NATO as well. Sometimes being an ambassador is difficult, right? Because you have to be as much NATO's ambassador to your country as your country's ambassador to NATO. Karel, also just 3 years after the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia turned into the Czech Republic, as we know, you joined NATO, and just a couple of years afterwards, in 2002, your government hosted this very important NATO summit in Prague. Tell us a little bit about the role you played in all of that and the significance of that summit for NATO.
Well, President Václav Havel was on his way from an OSCE conference, I believe, in Turkey in something like the year 2000, I believe, when he suggested that the next NATO summit could be held in Prague. I was very skeptical of that idea because I thought we haven't made ourselves a very good name here during our first year of membership, and right away we would be heading for a summit. But however true that was, the fact that President Havel had such international prestige and such a name that we managed to pull it off, thanks to him, I'm quite sure. The importance of the 2002 summit was prefaced by an important speech of President Havel in Bratislava, I think a year before, where he pointed out that a number of countries, including all the Baltics, ought to be also invited and admitted to NATO. I think he was the first world statesman who actually posited the question in this kind of a blunt form. And of course, this is exactly what eventually came to pass. One of my Baltic colleagues described to me how they were dancing on Charles Bridge in the night after they actually received the invitation.
Yes, and the fact that 7 members were invited in Prague so soon after the first wave of NATO enlargement had taken place after the Cold War sort of suggests that NATO sort of very quickly decided that enlargement was good for it, right, and was successful, and that was the way to go in building the future European security order.
Yes, well, we were asked during our admission talks, we were asked whether we would stand in the way of further enlargement of NATO, and I argued that I'd put my foot in the door, if necessary, to keep it open to new members.
How's it all worked out since 1999? That's already now sort of 25 years of alliance membership. Has NATO lived up to your expectations? What kind of role do you think the Czech Republic has been able to play in the alliance?
I was very happy to, over the years, notice how the role of the Czech Republic has been increasing in NATO bit by bit, having to do as commensurately to how the role of the Czech armed forces has improved and increased. And I think that the culmination of that was the election of General Petr Pavel as chairman of the military committee.
Now the president,
now the president, yes, indeed. So over a period of supposed brain death, I think we've gotten over this period of not being quite sure of ourselves, and now again, for the last certainly since the invasion of Ukraine, the role of NATO is very, very clear. Alas, this was not the case during the invasion of Georgia or during the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014.
Minister Martonyi, what do you think of Hungary's sort of progression as a NATO member since 1999, over 25 years?
What I would like just to underline very briefly, that Hungary's contribution to NATO is quite significant, especially in the light of its size. If you speak about the air policing operations and all the contributions which we make, for instance, in KFOR and elsewhere, I believe that Hungary is a contributor now in NATO operation. And at the same time, I think we have to underline and again that NATO is the indispensable cornerstone of the security of my country.
Minister, thanks. So I'm going now to go back to Maciej in Warsaw, who's going to ask you the final question about the future and what it holds for us. Maciej.
Mr. Ministers, the world and NATO have changed a lot in the 25 years since your countries joined NATO. How do you envision the future of the alliance?
Well, my sense of the importance of the alliance has not diminished at all. Certainly under today's security situation in Europe and indeed around the world. So I think that NATO has managed to, over the years, the question of out of area or out of business, which was posed many years ago by a leading American senator, is no longer a real question, because NATO has been operating out of area for many, many years now. And I think that these operations out of area have actually contributed to NATO's raison d'être and filled it with a number of tasks and allowed it to gather a number of important experiences. We see that continuing today, both geographically and in the depth of involvement of NATO in matters of the North Atlantic and beyond. And I think that this bodes well for the future of the alliance, which so long as the world is not at peace, which is not something that we are looking at right now, NATO will play a really critical role in the world's security.
Karel, thanks. Minister Martonyi, what do you think about NATO's future, the way you see it?
NATO is and will be indispensable for the security of my country and also the region where we live. Indeed, also for the world. I mean, that's the key point. And we all know that the alliance is now facing a difficult period. We may have discussions and debates, as I said, but the key issue is that both from a security perspective and from a value perspective, NATO is indispensable for future as well.
Minister, thank you very much, and also to you, Ambassador Kovanda, for joining us today, for being our special guest, for being generous with your time, but above all, generous with your memories and your intellects in taking us back down the road of history to all of the things that led up to the decision of Hungary, the Czech Republic, of course, Poland too, even though we couldn't discuss much about Poland today, but as you pointed out, it was very much also part of the team that you were working with and you were joining together. Joining NATO in 1999 and since. For my part, four things strike me. The sense that you didn't want to repeat some of the bad experiences of the past, particularly in terms of collective security arrangements. You wanted solid and dependable security arrangements, and that was very much moving towards NATO and the European Union. The way in which you worked together, the three countries, cooperating, sharing experiences, even if you had your individual negotiating processes, but that was a good example. The sense that you had that you would need to contribute to NATO to make it effective and not just be the consumers or the beneficiaries of NATO security. And I think also a sense that, you know, you had to make it a success because it was controversial sometimes within your countries, maybe less Hungary, but in the Czech Republic. So you had to demonstrate that it really was going to be the way ahead, but also to show the rest of the allies that you would be good allies, because had it been a failure, it would have been almost impossible for the Baltic states or Albania or Croatia, all of the other countries that have joined since, to join. So those are my takeaways. But again, thank you so much for sharing your experiences today in the NATO Through Time podcast.
Goodbye from Warsaw. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, Minister.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, Jamie, thank you very much for inviting me. This was a great pleasure.
Maciej, what did you make of all of that? There was a lot of history there, and of course, my first question is, what did that mean to you as somebody who of course, has learned it looking backwards from the history books rather than living through it at the time, although your parents and grandparents undoubtedly did. And the other thing is that you're Polish, of course, as everybody knows, and you know better than most of us. As a Pole, what kind of perspective on the things that they discussed would you have wanted to add? So those are my two questions to you, Maciej.
So first off, it's amazing to see, to mirror your feelings and your thoughts in other nations, because that always brings us together. We all came from pretty similar place as nations, and we all fought against it together, and we all had the same hopes. And from my perspective, a young person who lives in a world that is, free and with democracy, it's very good to remind yourself that it's not taken for granted. And listening to those stories only assures me that it's always single people who fight for this. It's always their choice, their courage, and it encourages me to shape the future of the alliance, the future of Europe and my country, because it all matters. It all matters, and our generation is needed, watching Poland evolve in NATO. And when we joined the alliance, we weren't strong from the military perspective. Of course, NATO, US needed us for certain things, but it's amazing to watch how we grow, how we contribute, how our military power grows and serves everyone. And as Minister from Hungary mentioned, air policy actions, we also do that a lot. Our planes are all the time up in the air, and that makes me also proud. And then the sake of the future of NATO, I just wanted to bring up the words of Madeleine Albright, who is very important from our Polish perspective. Whenever we learn about Poland joining NATO, we learn also about her. Once said that, speaking to the U.S. Senate, that we have learned that alliances make the threat of force more credible and therefore the use of force less likely. That by promising to fight if necessary, we can make it less necessary to fight. So in terms of my perspective, we should get stronger, get more together, and secure the future.
Well, Maciej, I'm grateful to you for mentioning the late Madeleine Albright. I worked with her closely when she spearheaded NATO's new strategic concept back in 2010, and it was a great experience. You probably know that her father, Joseph Korbel, was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and who fled to the United States to escape communism, and so she had Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, very much in her blood and in her DNA. Yes, I'm grateful to you also for pointing out what struck me listening to Minister Martonyi and Ambassador Kovanda was that democracies need democrats. You need brave individuals like the father of the minister who was imprisoned, Karel Kovanda as a student leader in the 1960s, who are willing to sort of stick their necks out and take risks. But also what struck me, Maciej, was that when they spoke about joining NATO in 1999, of course they mentioned security, protection, but they spoke a lot about values, right? Joining the same value system of the alliance and the EU as well, and wanting to have a seat at the table and, wanting to decide things and be treated as equals, because, of course, they'd had a history where, like Poland, they'd so often been in somebody else's sphere of influence. So that was interesting as well. But thank you again, Maciej, for joining me. From now, all the best. Take good care of yourself, and bye from Brussels.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and bye from Warsaw. Hope to see you again soon.
Dear audience, dear listeners, again, thank you for joining us at this NATO Through Time podcast. Hope you're enjoying not just this particular episode, but all of the series so far. As I've said, there are going to be others to come, which I'm sure are going to be equally interesting as today's podcast has been. But until we meet again, for now, from NATO headquarters in Brussels, goodbye and good wishes to all of you.